6 100% cotton watercolor papers you must try. I was blown away by your response to my last video where I tested 4 wood pulp papers along with a 100% cotton paper. Those were papers that I happened to have, and well, today I'm super excited to save you even more time and money by testing 6 cotton papers against each other. With 100% cotton paper, we know that water gets absorbed better into its fibers, and so it stays wet longer, which means you have more time to work with it, like when doing wet on wet washes and blending colors. It's also acid-free, so it won't yellow or degrade compared with wood pulp. You saw how some wood pulp papers behaved against my personal and longtime favorite arches, and now it's time to test arches against 5 other cotton papers. Of course, I can't cover every brand that you all raised, but I was able to get my hands on these 5 brands. Out of all of these, I've tried 2 before, the Arches and the Fabriano Artistico. But if I fall in love with any of these other ones, I could save some money since all of them are cheaper than the Arches and Fabriano per sheet. Like the other tests, I'm going to go through these in order from cheapest to most expensive. But before we get into the brand comparisons, I have a few more thoughts about paper that I didn't cover last time. Sizing. Sizing isn't about the physical dimensions. Sizing is a glue-like substance that they add to the paper to affect how it absorbs water. It's traditionally been gelatin or starch, but there can be synthetic sizing too. Paper that's unsized will soak up all the water. Think of a paper towel or a copier paper. Sizing a paper will allow it to resist some absorption of the paint into the fibers, and this also allows the colors to stay on the surface and to appear more vibrant. Luckily for us, watercolor papers come already sized. There's nothing that we need to do. But different manufacturers size differently, and that will affect your experience of their paper. The more papers you can try out, the more you'll get a sense of how sizing differs across various brands. When you're shopping, you might see some brands explicitly stating whether their sizing is applied internally and or externally, and whether it's gelatin, vegan, or synthetic, but I found that it takes a bit of digging to find out this information for most brands. Is this the front or the back? Does it even matter? This question comes up a lot, and honestly, it stumps me. Does it even matter what side you paint on? The short answer is I don't think so. Go ahead and paint on either side if you wish, but your mileage may vary depending on the paper. My simple approach is to just paint on the side that we're given. Whichever side faces you in a pad or block, I'm assuming the paper maker wants us to paint on that side. And here, Legion even has an FAQ QR code that tells us that both sides are sized consistently, so we can paint on either one just fine. And on papers that actually have a watermark, if you can read it from left to right, that's the side facing up. When you look on the back side, you may find that it looks the same, or it might be slightly different, or it may look very different. From my research, the differences are from the manufacturing process and not simply that you shouldn't paint on it. For example, if you see a grid-like pattern on the back, it's likely from the wire mesh that the original paper pulp was formed on. On many papers, I found that I can paint effectively on both sides. With this one, I tried and I was not very happy with the result, but that just may be my own painting style or my own preferences, so your mileage may vary. So let's get into the 6 papers that I have here. This is a Fuumuui 100% cotton paper block. It has 22 sheets. They say this 100% cotton cold pressed watercolor paper has a delightful texture and it ensures vibrant color absorption without drips or leaks. They also say it has exceptional durability and control, and it's suitable for both professionals and beginners in all wet and dry media. I couldn't find any sizing information about this paper, but it's available on Amazon. It's the cheapest of the 6 papers that I have today. Next up is Meeden. This 9x12 watercolor block works well with all wet or dry media, including watercolor, gouache, ink, pencil, etc. They say its surface withstands scraping, erasing, and repeated washes, making it highly suitable for better paint performance and durability. It's the next more expensive one on Amazon. Now, I didn't realize until after I bought this, but this may actually be the Baohong Academy or student paper that has just been rebranded to Meeden. I couldn't find any sizing information for this block, but I'm going to assume it's similar to the Baohong, which I'm going to go over next. Up next is Baohong Artist Watercolor Paper. It's not the Academy or student version. This 7x10" block actually came with this leaf blade, which is pretty handy. They say it's made from 100% cotton fibers, allowing it to absorb a lot of water without causing warping or causing colors to bleed. It has a light texture. They say it's scrub resistant, and it allows for a variety of watercolor techniques. My research showed that it's internally and externally sized. It's also the next most expensive one on Amazon. As far as I can tell, the main two lines of Baohong cold press that are available locally here in the United States are the Artist and Academy versions. If you search hard enough, you may be able to find a retailer that offers the Master's Choice line and a classic line of papers, but I believe those are geared towards other markets outside the US. Next, we have the Legion Stonehenge Aqua watercolor paper. This block is 7 by 10 inches. On the actual cover, it says, "Handcrafted with a watercolorist in mind, this rugged and textured substrate is our latest creation in artisan paper. Each cold press sheet naturally receives applied moisture, making it ideal for blending and lifting color." After some research, I found that it's both internally and externally sized. It's also the next most expensive paper I found per sheet. Next, we have Fabriano Artistico Enhanced Watercolor. This is also 7 by 10 block. They say that Artistico is a watercolor paper made with 100% cotton, produced with a special industrial process that reproduces the typical characteristics of handmade paper. And they say it also has improved surface sizing, stronger surface, 4 deckled edges, a fixed watermark, and it's vegan friendly. This was the next most expensive paper per sheet. Next up, we have Arches. This is my longtime personal favorite, 100% cotton paper. It's also a watercolor block. According to Arches, the naturally white acid-free sheets are sized with natural gelatin that penetrates to their core, providing outstanding absorbency and a consistent texture. At $3.11 list price per sheet, this is the most expensive of the 6 papers that I'm going to go through today. Before we move on to the paper test, if you've learned something so far, would you give this video a thumbs up? And if you learned 2 more things by the end of this video, would you consider subscribing to show your support? Thank you so much. Now let's go and test these papers. So like before, I've placed 2 squares on each of the 6 papers here. I'm going to apply a wet on dry technique and a wet on wet technique to each of the squares. And right off the bat, I noticed that there's a big difference in the tooth in some of the papers here. The Baohong paper is very, very rough compared to the other papers. The pencil that I put down, it was probably the hardest to write onto the Baohong. It's definitely not very legible what I wrote here. So here's a wet on dry technique on the Fuumuui. And then we're going to do wet on the Fuumuui. Now we're going to do the Meeden wet on dry. So far with both of these papers, they definitely suck up the water out of my brush really well. And I almost don't have enough water and paint on my brush. And then I'm going to do wet on wet. Now for the Baohong, it's really sucking it up a lot. So I'm going to run out of paint here. I'll have to grab a little bit more. I'm super excited to do this because it's my first time using most of these papers. So that's the wet on dry, and now I'm going to do wet on wet in the Baohong. They really sucked it up. Let me get in closer here for you to see that. Now we're going to do the Stonehenge wet on dry. Already this is a very different feel. It's much smoother, less tooth. I think there was some sort of surface cut here, which is leaving a mark. I don't know if I did that or if it just came like that. All right, so that's wet on dry, and then I'm going to do wet on the Stonehenge. Now we're going to do wet on dry on the Fabriano Artistico. This is also a pretty smooth paper, so I'm able to extend the paint a little bit further without having to reload. Now we're going to do wet on the Fabriano. And now for the arches. And you can see how the arches is definitely pretty toothy. Now we're going to do wet on wet. And now we're going to let these dry, and we'll come back in a little bit and test out a couple of other techniques on these, and we'll see how they fare. So it's been 30 minutes since I painted these squares, and you can see how they look so far. There's the Fuumuui, the Meeden, the Baohong, the Legion Stonehenge, the Fabriano Artistico, and the arches. Now, what I love about this test so far is that there isn't any one particular paper that stands out to me as one that I don't like. I can see usefulness to each one. Again, I mentioned before that the Baohong paper seems to be the roughest. It has the most texture, and you can see the pencil lines are probably the most jagged and hard to read, although my pencil was wearing down by the time I got here, so it's also hard to read on the arches. But for the most part, all of the squares look pretty consistent with each other. The squares in the Fuumuui might appear a little bit lighter than the rest, and that's partly because it was the first part of the test, and by the time I got to the end, these last few ones, the puddle of paint in my pan was actually pretty saturated, so I was able to put a little bit more saturated paint onto the paper by then, but don't pay attention to that. I'm looking more at sort of how the paper dried and what it looks like as opposed to the saturated nature of the pigment. I would say in the Legion Stonehenge, the one thing that sticks out to me a little bit is maybe there's a little bit of pilling going on here. I can't really tell, but that and the Baohong, the texture of the paper is showing through differently than, say, in the Fabriano and in the arches. I would say the Fuumuui and the Meeden, to me, kind of have the least impressive handling. The appearance of the paper seems to kind of distract for me, so that's maybe one standard I have. So now we're going to apply a lifting technique and see how the paper holds up to repeated lifting. That's where I wet the brush and try to lift out a line of paint. And I did this in the last test as well. I would expect cotton papers to take a little bit more effort for me to lift the paint off than a wood pulp paper, but at the same time, the cotton paper is going to be able to withstand that repeated brush stroke, and I would expect that it doesn't pill or tear up as easily as a wood pulp paper would. And that one seemed to work just fine. And now we're going to do that with the Meeden. Now I do feel like it's a little bit harder on the Meeden to successfully lift out the paint. It seems like the pigment got absorbed into the paper a little bit more deeply, perhaps. All right, we'll let that dry, and usually watercolor dries lighter, so I'm just going to let that rest for a few minutes. It probably will get lighter as we move on. Now to the Baohong. This is coming off easier than the Meeden was, I think. Now this wet on wet square dried lighter in the first place, so it may be harder to produce enough of a contrast here with the lifting, but I'm hoping I can still show how it behaves. And that seems to be pretty good, actually. Moving on to the Stonehenge. Not bad. It doesn't seem as bright, though, as the Baohong. Overall, the wet on wet squares seem to take a little bit more effort to lift out the paint and get to a wider layer. And now to the Fabriano. And that one seems to be a little bit harder to lift out. Now we'll try the wet on wet square. Sometimes you have to just wet the area first, reactivate it so that you can actually lift out the pigment. So the first few strokes might just be with a semi-moist brush, and then after that you can start to lift out the pigment. Again, I'm wiping it off every couple of strokes on the napkin. Finally, let's do the arches. It's also hard to lift this out of the wet on wet square. So I've lifted out a line from each of the squares on all 6 papers. You can see with your own eyes how these papers behaved. The Baohong paper has the roughest surface and it seems to make the paint pop a little bit more. But I'm also thinking ahead about if I were to do a finished piece on this, if I actually scanned this paper, the rough texture would be part of the character of the painting. And I'm not sure how much I like that, actually. The Fabriano paper is much smoother, as is the Legion Stonehenge. But let me know in the comments if you have any reaction to any of these. So we're going to let these dry a little bit longer, and when we come back, we'll try to reactivate the paint and see how they compare with each other. So it's been about an hour and a half, and I'm now going to try to reactivate the paint in this square and see how it behaves. And I'm going to let that sit, and I'm going to move on to the Meeden. And then to the Baohong. I'm wetting my brush and just gently going along the edge here to try to get the paint to flow out and diffuse a little bit to make a softer edge. This is just a useful technique for when you need to soften a hard edge. Maybe you used wet paint on dry paper, but now you realize you want that edge to just blend in a little bit better to the background. And I'm going to do that to the second to last paper here, the Fabriano. And then the arches. Just going over the edge very carefully, not trying to go too far inside. Now I'm doing it on the wet on dry squares only because that's where the most saturated amount of pigment is. So compared with the wood pulp papers that we did this on in the last video, the effect is very, very subtle here. You can see that the paint did reactivate, but it kind of barely just flowed outwards to the dry paper. So yeah, it's a very subtle effect here, and I'm gonna try to disturb it a little bit more. Here's the Fuumuui, and I'm gonna go in and just coax that out more, make it a little bit more obvious. This is the Meeden, the Baohong, so I let these sit for a few more minutes to let the paint resolve and dry a little bit. And you can see how these performed. I think most of these papers, they held up pretty well and pretty consistently. Now, like I said before, so much of our paper choices are going to come down to personal preferences. I can't really complain about any of these, but there are a few objective differences that I have already pointed out, like the roughness of the Baohong paper, how the arches and the Fabriano and the Legion Stonehenge are smoother. All right, so now it's been 24 hours since I painted these squares on all 6 papers. And let's just take a look at how these squares have finally played out. Now, in terms of actual differences between the results here, it's kind of hard for me to objectively pinpoint a lot of differences. They all absorb the paint pretty well, and I don't see the same kind of brushstroke marks that we saw with the wood pulp papers. So the paint has blended pretty well in the wet on dry examples, and pretty happy with how they turned out in all of them. I would say they pass muster for most of my potential use cases. In terms of preferences and things that I can identify, these are pretty subjective. I would say the Baohong, to the feel, it's definitely the roughest feeling of all the papers. It feels like sandpaper. The arches is also rough, but it's definitely smoother. You don't get the sense of like sandpaper like you do with the Baohong. The Baohong, though, the paint does end up looking like it pops a little bit more on the paper, which could be a nice effect if that's what you like. I do personally like the smoother papers and how they turned out, like the Fabriano, the Legion. This is also very smooth. And the Meeden and the Fuumuui are also very smooth. So in the end, I really wouldn't have any problem using any of these really for painting a serious painting that I want to complete and potentially sell. I felt like the papers held up well when I was painting. I didn't fear any unwanted buckling or potential tearing of the paper. In terms of my personal preference though, I would say that the Baohong is the one I probably would not turn to first because the texture is so prominent that I think it would be distracting for me and probably for my style of painting. The other factor is that if I needed to scan my painting on a Baohong piece of paper, which I do for all of my finished paintings, the texture, the pattern of the paper itself would definitely show up, and there are probably ways to mitigate that, but I don't necessarily want that to be a very prominent characteristic of my scanned image. So, but you know, that could be another video where I actually test out scanning these different papers to see how they might look, but that's my initial impression. Those are just some of my thoughts. Your mileage may vary. All in all, I think any of these would be great as potential papers where I needed to paint something serious and intentional, you know, to deliver to somebody or as something that I would sell. I think I still would like my arches. I still like the way it performs, and you know, that's probably just my personal preference. So take it or leave it. You can see how all these papers held up to these simple tests and take it from here. Okay, did I fall in love with any of these papers enough to move away from arches? It's hard to say. I think all of the papers performed pretty well. They all felt sturdy with no sign that the paper was going to tear apart, and they all absorbed the paint pretty well. You saw how they handled wet on dry and wet on wet and also lifting, and that there were slight variations in how the pigment was absorbed into the paper. 24 hours later, I think they all look good, but I still have a slight preference for the 4 more expensive papers. To my eyes, the Meeden and the Fuumuui ended up just a little inconsistent, but maybe that's a characteristic you might like. Definitely for my style of painting, where I like a paper that allows me to do some fine detail if I want, the smoother papers appeal to me more. But again, your mileage may vary, and that's totally fine. I'm just glad that I got to try out all of these papers in front of you and share them. Now you can have a reference point as you go out and experiment. Ultimately, you'll have to find what works for you. I'll still keep using my arches, but I'm happy to treat any of these as solid backups. If you're just getting started or looking for a simple approach to get back to watercolors after some time away, I've put together a free 1-page chart of essential supplies. Just click on the link in the description to download it. I'm Francis Shui, a working artist based here in New York City. Like, share, and subscribe if this helped, and please hit the bell icon to get notified of future videos. Until the next time, go and paint.